will be later on today, cold and outside.
Where are you going?
I'm going to the exotic town of Bridport in Dorset.
Why are you going there, Howard?
It's for a covert operation that's nothing to do with seaweed.
See, I think this is to do with Howard being a bit younger than us. I think he's going to some sort of rave thing.
Rave thing that's
I,
the rave thing that's nothing to do with seaweed.
No. Welcome to Sustainable Old Men. My name is Paul Harvey.
Hey!
I'm a podcast host and a coach, and I do various other bits and pieces. And the man who is clutching his face at the moment is because he's so overwhelmed because he's been promoted this week. Welcome, Gavin. Gavin Lemon.
Yes.
Hey!
Founder,
Promoted.
founder,
Indeed,
promoted, founder.
I am now. I always have been the founder of Sustainability, but now I find myself as the sustainable lead, which has got nothing whatsoever to pieces of string with little bits of seaweed hanging off them, because that's someone else's department.
Absolutely.
Anyone know who that could possibly be?
It could be possibly Howard Gunstock. Howard Gunstock, tell us about your bits of string with seaweed hanging off them.
Hi, I'm Howard Gunstock. I'm the CEO of Carbon Capture. We grow seaweed and create a circular ecology to slow down climate change.
Fantastic. Lovely to have you all back on the here this week. We had a terrible time in our last recording because Howard kept disappearing into his background, so we had to abandon it. And so this is what should have happened a couple of weeks ago.
Paul, didn't we say we weren't going to name names?
We had to name names because his internet connection went flaky.
But
So
they
look, we are back on
wouldn't know.
this
They wouldn't know that unless you mentioned it because they haven't seen the other one.
No, they wouldn't know it because I mentioned it last week when I said we weren't doing a show, so they would know about it. Okay, so we are here talking about these stripes that are behind us this week. This is actually no. Should we do some good news first? Let's do some good news. What
Do good news.
good news other than Gavin's promotion?
I've got some good news from Carbon Capture.
Yeah, you
we
bound to
have got our first company on board that is actively buying seaweed as part of their services. So a big shout out to Majestical, who are a video content company,
Right.
and they've built it into their contract for every single client that they bring on board. They're going to be buying meters of rope from Carbon Capture, which and they're then going to give those meters of rope to their customers, so they can sort of be part of the change that's happening in the seaweed revolution, which I think is absolutely fantastic and is exactly the sort of leadership that business owners should be taking in the climate change space. So big up to Majestical.
Yay! Well, I'm going to Majestical.
Well done, Katie. Well done, Katie Nuttall. You are a fantastic leader, and I take my hat off to you.
That's brilliant, brilliant news, brilliant news. I'm pleased for you, Howard, because I know you've been working on this for such a long time, and it's just nice to see this thing, this vision coming to fruition. It's fantastic to have that. And I know I'm actively helping you with this, so it's great fun to be part of that process.
I've got a piece of good news that's kind of a silver lining of some bad news.
You're good at that.
Yeah, I try my best. As we may or may not know, Texas is actually having a massive heat wave at this moment in time. Texas is a ruby red state, as in totally Republican. Democrats' climate change doesn't exist and all that jazz.
But they're sitting they've got this situation around them where they're sitting in a total heat dome, aren't they? There's like the weather is locked in around them, and it's not going away.
So they believe that climate change is a bit woke and therefore doesn't really exist.
Mm-hmm.
So they as a consequence are very oil kind of focused, and yet in this heat wave, it's renewables that are saving the day, solar and everything else. And I think the Republican leadership is struggling to actually convey that message because they don't want to convey that message. So that to me is a silver lining, because
yes, absolutely.
Great silver lining. Can we talk about Rishi's backtracks?
Yeah, that's the not so nice, is it?
Yes.
I can understand the logic they're coming from. So, for the sake of our listeners, Rishi Sunak has said, well, I think it's not. Is it Rishi Sunak has himself admitted it, or is it the Foreign
I think it's
Office?
Rishi. I think it's Rishi.
So
Let's just
anyway,
blame Rishi.
so all right, okay. So during the COP27, they agreed to
Six.
do 26, was it?
Got 26.
COP26, they agreed to do 11.9 billion pounds of aid, which would be directed entirely at climate change projects. And they're now talking about halving that.
Yes, on the grounds that we've spent the money helping Ukraine. And that money was going to pay for lots of projects in less developed countries.
Well,
Really, really big shame.
it is a big shame, and I can. I guess the difficulty with this, I can sit in both sides of this. I don't agree with what he's done, but I can also see when you're sitting here looking at the balance sheet of UK PLC, you're going to go, we've got to make some hard choices.
Yeah,
and
okay.
his voters
No.
will expect something different. That's the difference.
No, right. So this is the point. It's not UK PLC. It's not UK PLC at all. It's a government. They collect tax, and if they don't collect enough tax, they can then ask the Bank of England to literally print money. It's not UK PLC. It's effectively legal fraud in every way, shape, or form. It's a probably conversation for another podcast.
Well, it is, and it's good to see you so activated around it and triggered.
It's terrible.
There is.
He says
I think Howard is right, and there's some other fundamental issues. We know about the interest rate going up. The government's own borrowing is now costing a fortune, and it is borrowing now at higher rates. So that's an issue. How did we get here? Was it the Ukraine crisis? Was it Brexit? Or was it Mad Liz Trust? Or was it a combination?
Was it COVID? We've been, and this is nothing to do with the climate strikes. We've been borrowing off the Bank of Magic Money Tree since 2008, and we're now 100 and something% of GDP as a country. It's ridiculous. It may be that it's there or thereabouts. The only reason why we have interest rates so high is so that we can pay off the loan debt that we've borrowed from the IMF. So it's not sustainable. And let's go on to something that isn't also sustainable, like the climate strikes.
Well, let's go to the Rishi Sunak thing is a really a bad taste in the mouth, and I don't actually know how there's nothing we can do about it other than vote the buggers out when the opportunity comes.
True.
At the rate they're going, there's going to be enough by-elections to actually.
I was just thinking exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Just get a few more.
Didn't one of the
MPs gropers?
Didn't one of the MPs actually step down the other way because of this change? Was it Zach Goldsmith or something? Walked out.
Zach Goldsmith also happened to be one of the people that criticised the committee investigating into Boris Johnson. So we can either take the yes, he stood down because of the government's environment policy, or we can take the more cynical view of he stood down because his name's been plastered all over the papers for being very, very critical of the Privileges Committee.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, this is the mess of UK politics. There we go. So climate stripes. Look, this list, these bands behind us.
What do they represent, Howard?
Yes, Howard, you're the knowledge on these.
Okay, so I believe these are the stripes that show the Earth's average temperature in the last 50 years, since 1970 to 2018. And you can, I've actually got stripes that go back even further down, back to 1880, that condense the amount of red. So in the last 40 years, we have taken on the average temperature of our planet from a nice Holocene equilibrium, which is you can see on the blue stripes to this side. And with the increasing levels of CO2 and the amounts of pollution in our atmosphere that have retained because of greenhouse gases and ice sheet loss, we've moved all the way from this side across to this side, where the average temperatures are now not pink or light red, but they're dark red moving towards black. And that is devastating, because it has a knock-on effect onto so many different things. And I hope that we're going to get to a chance to talk about some of these interacting topics today, really.
We can cover planetary boundaries and quite a few, because this all knocks on to all of them. Just for the record, the stripes were by Reading University, if I'm not
Reading University, yes. Reading University, who also are responsible for a number of my viral posts about to do with water, if you go onto my LinkedIn and carbon capture LinkedIn site. But
where do we find your LinkedIn? Where do we find your LinkedIn, Howard?
Everywhere you look and you cite Howard Gunstock. But what I want to start, I think what I'd like to start off with on this topic is to do with water security. Because actually, what we're starting to see with massive climate change activity, things like droughts and floods and loss of ice, is something that's also equally as interesting, which is where we get our water from. So, although we live on a blue planet and it is 70% water, there's only 1% of the water on the blue planet that is drinkable. And of that 1%, so there's a brilliant little Netflix documentary called the Water Crisis. It's a fantastic little documentary. Yeah, so that 1%, 50% of that is used by big business and agriculture and farming. And of what's left of that 1%, we have to allow for to use for waste disposal and various other bits and pieces. We have, with our increasing population, a depleting resource of aquifers. Aquifers are the underground resource and store of water, because that's where we get our water from, that's disappearing at an alarming rate. The other day I was in a country that I can't talk about too much actually at the moment. But anyway, the other day I was visiting a country for work, and we were talking about we had a conversation to do with the disappearance of and the availability and water scarcity. And what is really frightening is that even though we're getting vast amounts of rain and floods in some areas, those underground aquifers are not being replenished. And what's happening is, as the water drains out, because we're taking too much resource away from the underground aquifer, air is getting in, and that is causing some of the stones to oxidize. And when the water then returns, it then has sulfuric acid in the water. That's no good for anybody or anything. So I'd just like to start off by talking about the fact that as we're heating up, not only are we losing available resources and land, and people are having a harder time to have food, the key element to life, which is water, is disappearing in front of our eyes, even though we're on a blue planet.
So if the tech people were on this call, which thank God they're not, they'll go desalination plants. That's our solution.
Great. And the desalination plants that are our solution are far, far, far more expensive than allowing our planet just to cool down. So there are ways to do that. They have desalination plants over in the Middle East.
I was going to say, where are they?
Yeah, they're in the Middle East. And do you know what they run on? They run on oil.
Yep.
And the other side of those plants is they cause massive amounts of brine to be produced, which is not
huge amounts of brine. Not only that, the water that is produced isn't actually full of minerals. It's
No,
just
it
literally,
has to be mineralized afterwards.
yeah. So therefore, there's an extra process that's required when nature actually takes care of it ourselves. If we just allowed
I
our
mean,
planet,
there's an upside. Well, not an upside. There is places that they are sorting this out to some extent, and in some places around Saudi Arabia, there was a fantastic LinkedIn post a couple of months ago about it, and what they had done is they'd looked at the local topography of the land, and recognised that they get water. They do get enough water. It just doesn't stay there, and so it uses permaculture techniques to create these natural gullies and create processes where the water can sit and seep into the ground, and then you
to
create
refill
fruit
the
trees.
aquifers.
Yeah, and you can create roots and trees around this. They call them swales in agriculture, in
Yeah,
permaculture,
I've read about this. Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
they're fantastic. So you basically just create this slope, which runs along the down the slope at the same angle. So basically you're creating like a trough where the water cannot go down. It has to sit in the trough and then percolate away.
And that's a better solution because that's more nature based. Howard, a fantastic critique of desalination plants because it's not a fix. It's not a fix.
It's not, and again, you're looking for further and further advancements in technology to replace the things that the planet and nature does by osmosis. You know, it does it by proxy. It's absolutely incredible. I had a conversation about this the other day, to do with the amount of resources that we're losing as a consequence of the ice caps melting. And what's really interesting is that as one of the biggest things about the ice caps melting is that it is the biggest factor in reflecting heat from the sun back out of our atmosphere. And as we lose our ability to reflect the heat, and that means that we're going to have more and more greenhouse gases that are building up, and some of the worst greenhouse gases that you can get are mist because it literally contains all the greenhouse gases. We need to start to think of more practical solutions. So I read this really amazing article about a guy in, I think it's Italy, but it might be in the Czech Republic. I could be wrong, on both of those locations. But what this guy does is he runs a volunteering organization that paints people's roofs white.
Yep.
Why? Because that will give us a chance to reflect it. So he collects money in a charity, and it's something, by the way, that absolutely anybody can do. You can just paint your roof white, and it will help with climate change. It will be more beneficial to climate change, I would argue, and I have no facts on this, but I'm just saying it'll have more beneficial to climate change than recycling would do in your household, because it's actually trying to mitigate some of the greenhouse gases.
There are a couple of very new work being done on some paints that will reflect heat.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it is it not just doesn't just reflect it back in the atmosphere, it reflects it out into space because it changes the frequency, and that frequency actually can pass through the atmosphere.
So,
well, this boils back to, sorry, Gav. This boils back to our understanding of what weather actually is.
Yeah.
So the definition of weather is the uneven heating of a non-conformed planet from the radiation from the power of our sun. So effectively, because we've got peaks and valleys and troughs and different landscapes, the planet doesn't heat up at an equal level. So therefore, the different heats cause winds and storms and different weather patterns, rain, etc. Because we're not on a completely even orb, and because of the spin of our planet, it also doesn't allow for the planet to heat up in a manner that is even to all the different land masses and water bodies. So this is something that we need to. This is an area that really needs so much talking points and so many has got so much area for development. It's untrue. We
it's
could do some huge stuff.
Gavin.
it's going to be interesting because I suspect, Paul, that this is going to be not one episode. It's going to be several episodes.
Of course.
One of the consequences of what Howard's mentioned, if you think about water scarcity, the climate just rising, biodiversity loss, humans have a natural desire to survive. We're not just going to sit there and die of thirst. We're not going to die of hunger. We have legs. We move.
Yeah.
One of the challenges is going to be, there's going to be, this is based on a UN estimate, which I suspect is understated, 130 million migrants purely from climate change. Now, we're already in a situation where swell of government in this country is put the shutters down on this country. 130 million people moving out of in-hospital areas will have to go somewhere, which is then going to become a vicious circle, because as Howard says, if they move to certain other areas, that's going to put more pressure on the water in those areas, creating more scarcity. So this is something that's got to be looked at on a global scale, and the rich in the north can't sit there with their eyes and ears and everything shut. We've got to contribute to the solution.
Even the EU are struggling with this, aren't they? I mean, they're even trying to put in some hefty. You say that Suella Braverman's doing some stuff in the UK. Even the EU is starting to go now. We've got to work on this as well, and they're coming up with some pretty xenophobic policies I can understand the issue, because I mean, like some people say, I've got friends who live in Germany say Germany is not the country I recognize anymore.
No, it's the growth of the authoritarianism and the right wing.
Well, indeed, but I mean, a lot of people say they don't recognize those countries anymore because of the influx of the people from them.
I think once we start to understand, I think there's a just cause to talk about that. We need to really start to think more on as a planet, as a species, holistically, rather than as individual states and countries. Because we've for years as we were growing as nations in the 1900s and the earlier 20th century, we were individual states, and that was fine because we all had individual infrastructure. But now we're starting to look at global ways of communicating and global ways of financing. The internet is the world's first global communication platform.
Yeah,
that is ubiquitous, right? And Bitcoin and its compatriots are the world's first global money supply, and there will be more global solutions to certain aspects of our lives. But we are the same species. It doesn't matter where we live. When a Labrador dog sees a white Labrador dog and then a black Labrador dog and a grey, they're all the same. They're all Labradors.
Yeah.
It just happens to have a different fur. Why does it? We need to be starting to think in these terms very quickly.
It's not necessarily the colour that causes the issue. The colour is the signpost that people have. Someone is different. What makes people resist those interactions is culture and things that people do. It's going to be that's where the race problem comes in. It's not the fact they've got the skin of the color of the skin is the actual issue. It's the fact that they're different from me.
Yes,
and they do things different. They have a religion that's different from mine. They have traditions that are different from mine, and they bring them in and they start doing them in my country. Sorry, I'm being particularly difficult here.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how this is also directly relevant to the strike.
Well, it isn't. But this is where the xenophobia comes from. This is where the right wing feed on this. They feed on difference, and will have you looking at difference. It's just something for our audience to recognise the fact that those in the right who want to push an agenda will pick on this difference. Like an example being the two submarines that sunk. Well, the submarine that sunk and the boat of What were they called? They weren't called migrants. They were called something else. No, they were called migrants rather than refugees.
Yeah.
And the money spent on both is disproportionate.
And the number of people involved was disproportionate.
Yeah.
Over 200 on the boat, 5 on the submarine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
which is the same conversation, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, let's just dial this back, right? So there's some observations that we have to make, right? The story of money and the story of wealth is not going to change the climate stripes. Because for as long as the story of money exists, and that narrative being I have and you don't, broadly speaking, the people that have will carry on doing what they want to do, and the people that don't have money will carry on fighting for injustice, for the injustices that are caused. Now, those sorts of things can't change, but what can change is how you communicate and guide, and that's the transition between cultures that I'm trying to weave a narrative here, right? That's the transition between different cultures and societies into how we actually come back to adapting to the massive change that, as you can see behind us, in these climate stripes. And let's be clear here, these stripes are the result of hundreds of years of extractions of minerals and resources from our planet. And they are the culmination of a few million people at the very top making some very poor choices. So the questions that start to come back is, how do you start to make those better choices to help mitigate some of those risks? I'm not going to be talking about that guy there, the carbon capture thing.
But it's relevant, but we're not talking about it. Fair enough.
Maybe I'll weave it into the story in a bit. But I think what we're trying to talk about here is, how do you align people who have disparate views, dispersed views, into something that's slightly more aligned? And one of the ways that I talk about, one of the ways that I've mentioned and thought about it, and only now in this moment, is how we're on with this political divide, right? In the UK, I know in other countries, there are other parties that are equivalent, but we have the Conservatives, which are about conserving the existence, and just in the name, conserving what exists currently. And the issue is not that that isn't a good principle in theory, because that serves, it's about conserving, you can look at it as conserving our nature, our wildlife, right? But that's not what's actually happening. What's actually happening is massive change is happening. And I remember when I was a young business manager, X amount of decades ago, there was a book called Who Moved My Cheese? Right? And this is exactly the same in the climate change space. So those naysayers, and the people and the climate change activists are effectively the hem and haw of Who Moved My Cheese, because they're saying, no, this is not changing, and I'm just staying here. And yet you're watching destruction and death happening. And yet, if you're actually able to go about creating something, understand that staying here and doing something is not going to change the situation, that the planet is heating at an alarming rate, and we've had two of the hottest days, the world's hottest day on record for 2 days running, and about to happen for a third time. Gavin, you were, before we started rolling, you showed us this incredible picture diagram. Could you flick that back up for us, please?
Share that screen again.
There you go.
The power of technology.
Wow. Yeah, and being prepared. So now, that is that's incredible. Do you want to talk us through that, Gav?
Yeah, sure. So the bulk of this chart is in the grey, which conforms basically to the bluer and the lighter colours of the climate stripes behind us.
Mm-hmm.
The light blue, which you can probably visibly see, is last year, and you can see that is going to be in comparison, it's at the top end of the grey, so therefore it's one of the red stripes behind us. What has happened this week? And you can see 4th of July 2023, the average temperature of the globe. So if people are thinking, oh, it was warmer than that in the UK, you've got to consider that it was winter in the southern hemisphere. So the total temperature of the planet, or the average temperature of the planet at any particular time is shown by this graph.
Yeah.
This is the mean of all the temperatures, isn't it, effectively?
This is the mean average of the temperatures across the planet, which comes back to Howard's point about the fact it's uneven and it's not conformed across the planet. Yeah. It was 17.18, which that's the 4th of July, which I think was the Tuesday. The Monday was the all-time record, which was then broken literally the next day.
And to build on that,
sorry, Howard, one second. The interesting thing, I think, if you guys recall, when I was talking about this breaching of 1.5, I thought that it was going to be 1 point in this decade, and I thought I'd read it was going to be 2027. It was the 4th of July this year. That is 1.5 has been broken already this year. And that is beyond frightening. Sorry, Howard, over to you.
No, but in South America, it's meant to be winter. And there were in excess of 300-400 towns and cities in South America, which had 30-degree heat in winter.
Yes, and I must caveat this by the fact there is a climatic phenomenon called El Nino happening at the moment. However, it's off the scale. It's well out of kilter of any previous El Ninos. Yeah. And they're saying, oh, it's a natural phenomenon. No, it is a natural phenomenon, yes, but it has been super, super altered by man.
Yeah. And I remember talking on some podcasts earlier this year. I think one might have had with Paul, and I said that I know we talked about hot weather last year, and it was how hot it was, and I said I think that's going to look like a spring day compared to this year. And I hate being right about these things, but this is where we're at. We are.
In context, I live in the north of Scotland, basically on the Moray Firth coast, so we get hot weather, but we don't get that much hot weather. And I was in Garmouth the weekend before last, running as it happens.
Running? Were you running?
Yeah,
were you running?
Yeah, I was in my ultra guys.
Oh, okay.
But it was 30 degrees in Garmouth. I mean, Garmouth never gets 30 degrees. Scotland don't do this far north. We don't get 30 degrees.
But the interesting thing is, for us in the UK, we've just had the warmest June in history.
But of course, we all love it, don't we? Everyone goes, it's great, the weather's lovely.
Literally that, Paul, it gets reported saying warmest June in history. Rather than being a warning, it's accompanied with photographs of beaches, people enjoying themselves. It's reported as a good thing.
Yeah. So this is the difficulty that we have, right? As a species, we're not designed to hibernate. We're designed to exist most effectively in sunshine. But our media and our reporting, the way we're doing things is really skewed. What's fascinating about the changes that are happening is that we suddenly start to see things from a different perspective when it's us, because we're in the UK, we're in the slightly northern area of Europe, and therefore we have a slightly more temperate climate. But even when I did a post the other day where the International Space Station took a photograph of England, Scotland, and Wales, and it was just scorched.
Yeah, I saw that one.
Not a green and pleasant land; it's a scorched and parched land. And that's the second time that's happened in a couple of years, in the second year running. And someone made a little comment on the post. He said, as my granddad says, the seasons will change, it will rain, and everything will be okay again. And I said, yeah, but here's the climate stripes. Your granddad lived in these blue sections over here. Yeah, not in these red sections over here. It's not comparable.
It's interesting you say that, because and Paul, we're all old enough to remember 1976, which is which we'll see it again this summer. We'll see. We're predicted to get very close to 40 degrees again. Might not be quite as hot as last year.
Mm-hmm.
But already hosepipe bans are starting to appear in England, and we've literally only just finished June, so they're appearing really early. And like Howard said, the deniers will say, "Oh, it was worse than this in 1976." Yeah, but 1976 was a single year. As Howard just said, I think we've had 2 previous years of hot years. Last year being extremely hot, and this will be the 3rd year. So I don't know if you can see it on the stripes.
That's 19. This is 1976. This red line here. Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. That's 76. And look what happened beforehand, and look what happened just slightly afterwards.
Yeah.
It's really about 1980 onwards that it starts to get really.
It doesn't take much Googling to find out the 8 of the 10 hottest years in Britain have been in the last decade.
Yeah.
What is quite shocking, though, is that it's still the amount of denial that's so deeply ingrained into stuff. I see things passing through LinkedIn. There was some Australian guy talking about, like, there's no positive proof that temperature and carbon dioxide are linked together. No one's ever showed this. It's like, you're talking bollocks. Of course, it's been shown time and time and time again. It's like, I just don't understand how these people get platforms and still people cheer them on, you know.
It's an 80-20 rule.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So 20% of the population are still either in denial or don't think it's going to be as bad as everyone says it is.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge you've got, which comes back to your point about I don't know how they got a platform, is the BBC's policy is equivalence. So despite it being 80-20, you have one representative of the 80 and one representative of the 20, when strictly speaking, it should be 3 from them, 1 from them. But equivalence
means... Which is why Nigel Farage got on TV all the time during the Brexit conversation, because he was the only person available.
Exactly. So that is an issue. The challenge, I think, is, and that's one reason why the 3 of us are on this in the first place, is no one's come up with how do we improve this. Well, no one apart from carbon capture has come up with a brilliant solution to solve the crisis. And that's
let's be clear. I don't think that we can. I don't think how amazing carbon capture is doesn't solve the crisis. It looks at one element of the problem.
It's got to become
we're talking about
everybody's problem, not just carbon capture's.
Yeah, that's true.
We just come back to something Howard said earlier. It is everybody's problem. That I think we all agreed on. It has been caused. It's the inequity of carbon emissions is frightening. And for the next podcast, I'll bring up a chart of who is emitting and who is not, and it is totally up at the top 1, 2, 5, 10%.
But that 1, 2, 5, 10% is anyone earning over actually $25,000, isn't it?
If you measure it in economic terms, but they happen to be living in specific places. Yeah. The US, for sake of argument. I know the US will then point to Canada. Not Canada, China.
Some of the other interesting facts about the reason why so much of this climate change denial is led by America is to do with fuel security.
Yeah.
So America not so quick to transition onto renewable energy because it has its own supply of oil, right? Why would it need to do anything other than do that? But when you look at the EU as a whole, as a bloc, it doesn't have its access to its own oil, especially as the UK left. What a little tiny oil that it had is practically null and void. So it has to create renewable energies as an entity to be able to survive. But that changes when you go to Russia, and that changes when you go to China, and that changes when you go to Australia, because the different energy sources are and the viewpoints of those platforms will depend on the country and its own energy source.
Did you not see? Sorry, Paul. This is slightly on topic, but
on topic. That's
yeah. Honestly, I think this is correct. The previous Australian Prime Minister, was that Abbott?
He was one of them. They've had a few. Go on.
So Abbott came into the Australian Parliament with a lump of coal, saying, "This is the future."
Yes,
and it's on the internet. I'm flabbergasted.
and he carried on doing it, didn't they? I mean, the stuff that they did in Australia.
I mean, he dredged the Great Barrier Reef, didn't he?
Yeah, something like that. They did all sorts of stuff out there, really weird stuff.
But they are one of the biggest suppliers of coal in the world, and the reason why they export coal is to power China. That's the biggest buyer of coal. Right. So it's why just like America, why do they not want to change their motor car industry to renewable energy cars, etc.? Because the main income stream for the economic development of that country is through fossil fuels. The government gets income and tax. Australia PLC. Sorry, the Australian government gets massive amounts of income and tax from what's the mining company, Australia. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. They get all this money from the mining companies, and that's how they fund they pay for their services. To change that is hard, and what we're talking about really is, how are we as a species able to adapt to change? And as a human race, we're very, very slow to adapt to change.
Sorry, Paul.
I was going to say, we talked about there are some solutions, and the one that Howard represents is one of them.
Correct.
Gavin, you obviously work in the sustainability industry. And you'd never talk about your work. You'd never actually mentioned it on here at all, or the people you work with, and maybe that's because you can't. But are there organisations and companies that are addressing this and taking this on board from your perspective?
Right. So tying it in to something Howard's mentioning, there are a lot of potential solutions out there. There's probably thousands, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But Howard is right on point. There's a lot of vested interests in not seeing those solutions get the airtime, the publicity they need to succeed, the investment they need to succeed, because there's a lot of people who are more interested in maintaining the status quo. You touched on the Conservatives conserving. I would say they like to conserve the status quo. Well,
if you're a company with shareholders, your responsibility is to maintain that business. And I know it doesn't have to be, but that's the simple logic they have.
I would challenge that.
Okay.
As in the UK, your fiduciary duty is to protect the interests of the shareholders, and that generally is perceived to be maintaining or increasing dividend growth. Which, if you think logically, is short term. Paul Polman at Unilever stood up in 2010, 2011, spoke to his investors saying, we're not going for short term growth. We have a long term strategy.
Didn't they kick him out?
Sorry?
Didn't they kick him out because of that?
Not initially. He left after about 10 years because they went down the route of sustainability, developing sustainable solutions to issues. He's a legend in the sustainability industry. Unilever as a company potentially is not quite so legendary, but as a function of what he tried to achieve, Unilever was the third most searched company on LinkedIn. It was the third most attractive company to people for people to work at. It was only beaten by Apple and Google.
And there was a French guy in Danone who was also
Yes.
doing very, very good stuff, and he also got kicked out for being too sustainable.
Yeah.
And then you look at what happened in Sri Lanka when they decided they were all going to go to renewable energies, and they had an uprising last year where they overthrew the president because they wanted to attain net zero. And I think what's actually happening in this space is you can't, although you can have pockets of goods, to make a transition like that in a heartbeat doesn't happen. You can't switch off fossil, even if we. And I know I know I'm saying this right as a big climate advocate, climate change advocate. You can't switch off fossil fuels tomorrow because there's too many infrastructures and dependencies that happen to it. But what you can do is plan the transition towards it. And what's not happening is that plan. We're creating opportunities to allow it to happen. But the people at the top who are making decisions aren't planning for that activity because they don't feel that there's a fiscal benefit to them or their shareholders.
No one's actually saying the last well we drill will be on this date, is there? No one's actually we're going to turn that plant off on that date. They're not saying that.
So can I make 2 points on what Howard just said? The people at the top in this context, politicians in the UK, 5-year term, and then re-election. Why should they? Can you point to any of the red stripes, Howard? Don't mind, just point to any of them. So a politician then, why should he make a decision that's going to affect something in 10 years' time? Because he's not going to be there, or she.
And the same thing with university grants, right? I don't know the last time there was a university grant that was handed out for a 100-year study.
Yeah. Well, I've got a slight caveat that with, because where I live not far from a place called Rothamsted that's in Harpenden, and there's a 100-year study going on there. So, but
there's not many. Okay.
That, in fairness, that's agriculture, right? Second point is human beings, human nature, human behavior. We will only make a change when we are motivated to make a change. Now, that could be we're forced to, a legal change. We might want to make a change because the grass is greener, economic change. Or there may be some other fundamental reasons. So most businesses are run by humans, in case you haven't spotted. AI hasn't quite fulfilled every role. So a business will not make a change unless it thinks it's economically beneficial to do so, which is one of the advantages of adopting an ESG or sustainability strategy. But let's assume they think, oh, it's far too costly. Then they won't make the change until they're forced to, which is regulation. And the regulatory changes start at as Howard's implied before, starts with the top companies, doesn't affect the smaller, lower companies to start off with. And then it filters in the UK, we adopt a trickle down kind of mentality. So until we get to I'm worried that the stripes might have to go black, and then suddenly we want to make a change. As you implied, Howard, we're in dark red, and yet Sri Lanka will rebel. Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said on that. I think actually that's a reasonably good place to end to sort of bring this section of the podcast to a close, because actually it's a really good thought there, Paul. I don't know what you think about.
No, I think it's a good place. I was wondering how we would tie this up, because I like to end on something of value on this one for people to.
I think that was really good.
I think it is good, and I think these stripes were projected across the White Cliffs of Dover a couple of weeks ago with a talk about climate change, which I thought was so apt at the time, and that's why I chose to use these things, because we have got to start having these conversations. And us three of us, we can all do our bit, but we can't change this. We can only push against it.
Right.
So much.
There's a point that if you watch my LinkedIn, which Howard and you both do, that I have quoted the Dalai Lama a number of times, which comes back to, and I'd love to end on this quote: if you think you are too insignificant to make a change, try sleeping in a room with a mosquito.
Very, very true. Very true.
Very true.
But it's about coming together, isn't it? I mean, no, it's about coming together. We ain't going to do this on our own as individuals. It's about forming links, having these conversations, and forcing that change. And that's why people jumped. That's why older people jumped into Wimbledon yesterday and threw confetti over the place. You don't see this? Just Stop Oil people yesterday threw confetti all over them, and they weren't young people. They were older, well-established people our age. You know, it's like, this is the truth of it. And it was a lovely photograph where the young people were clearing up the mess. As someone pointed out, there's a good allegory in that. Anyway,
Yeah, good point.
So, what are we going to talk about next time? Next time on Sustainable Old Men.
oh yes, good voice. You've done that before.
Yeah.
Well, and we could continue with this in terms of other, because there are a couple of other things that need to be looked at, isn't there? One of them is the planetary boundaries, and the other thing is demographics.
I was just about to say that. Yeah, that's brilliant. So come back this time next week to find out more about the climate stripes, sustainable, the planetary boundaries, and demographics and birth rates. Dun, 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 dun.
Thanks, guys.
I promised audience that one day we'll get Howard under control.
Nice.
Until then.